saddle up and head him off at the pass. Hit the subscribe button right now so you don't miss a single weekly action-packed Wild West adventure. Join the posse today. Chapter 1. For 2 long days and nights, Deuce moaned, screamed, and cursed. Campbell, drunk on cheap whiskey, sobbed through the violent nightmares. He had pulled off his dusty boots during those delirious, feverish hours, shaking out imaginary snakes. Twice, he tried to burn down the rickety cabin. He had even attempted to end his own life. Now he crouched in a dark corner, his bloodshot, wild, maniacal eyes locked on the boy, Rip, who was trying to act brave. Deuce was planning something sinister. Rip had hidden the heavy 6-shooter, the old carbine, and the sawed-off shotgun. Every sharp knife he could find was stashed away in the cabin's dark corners. But there were thick hunks of stovewood Deuce could use to bash his skull in. Deuce was big and husky, weighing close to 200 pounds, all of it dense, hard muscle. Rip was a slim, wiry 15-year-old, but he had Deuce's 6-shooter tucked under his faded, worn flannel shirt. "Fetch me my jug, you little rat," Deuce growled, his voice a raspy, menacing rasp. Rip didn't move. The heavy brown jug sat just by Deuce's bunk, almost within reach of the man's enormous, outstretched hand. It was bait, an excuse to get Rip close enough to grab. Then Deuce would choke him or beat him, just as he had done a dozen times before. Ugly dark blue bruises marked Rip's neck, his battered body welted and sore. Deuce always got like this when he drank too much. Rip edged toward the door, but Deuce, with the cunning of a madman, had blocked his narrow escape. The boy was trapped. "Fetch me that jug, you sniveling little coyote." Rip didn't move. Beneath his suntanned, freckled face, his skin was pale and cold. His bloodless lips quivered, but his sharp eyes held a brave, unyielding light that no earthly fear could extinguish. He wondered if he'd have to use the 6-shooter. Deuce reached for the jug, pulled the cork with his teeth, and tilted it back. He drained the last drop of fiery moonshine, then hurled the jug at Rip. The heavy missile missed the boy's head by mere inches. Coyote. Just a yellow-bellied coyote. Rip crouched, watching. It was only a matter of minutes now. Deuce would demand the other jug. The jug that was broken. Rip glanced at it next to the door, hidden in a dark shadow. He had dropped it coming down the steep, treacherous trail from the still in the cave. There was no more moonshine. Deuce was a ruthless cow thief, a murderous horse thief, and a cold-blooded killer. He'd knifed 2 men in drunken brawls at the Crooked Creek Saloon. He sold stolen beef and peddled cheap whiskey to weary prospectors, though the placer gold was panned out long ago. Winter was coming, and hard times had driven Deuce into a drunken, dangerous rage. Rip waited. He hated Deuce with all his heart. He loathed him, feared him, and knew he would have to kill him or be killed. Deuce didn't know Rip had the 6-shooter. The big man crept closer, crouching like a starving predator. "Where's that other jug, you sneaky skunk?" "What other jug?" "The one you're hiding. Drag it out." "There ain't another jug," Rip said, his voice unsteady. "Liar. I'm going to break your back. I'll bend you across the bunk until you snap like a dry twig. I'll kill you, you little whelp." Closer, closer. Deuce was almost within reach. Rip slid the gun from his waistband. Its blued barrel gleamed steady in his trembling hands. "Come closer and I'll kill you," Rip said, his voice tense and low. Deuce laughed, low and hoarse, and picked up a thick stick of stovewood. His heavy-jawed face twisted into a crazed, feral sneer. "Stand back," Rip mumbled. "I'll kill you." Deuce lunged, hurling the stick. The deafening explosion of the gun filled the cramped cabin. Acrid smoke clouded the air. Deuce Campbell lay on the cold dirt floor, blood spreading from a hole in his chest. His wild eyes rolled back, and frothy blood bubbled at his lips. "Kid, you killed me." Rip fetched a rusted pick, a tattered shovel, and an old lantern from the barn. The frozen ground was tough, but Rip knew how to dig. Slim as he was, he had wiry, determined strength. Deuce deserved a proper burial, even after all he'd done. By the cold light of dawn, Rip had dug a deep grave. He built a simple pine box from shed lumber, sweating as he dragged it to the cabin. Deuce's body was heavy, but Rip managed to wrap it in a dirty tarp and slide it into the rough coffin. As he nailed the lid shut, men rode up. "Planting corn?" the sheriff from Chinook called down, grinning. Rip climbed out of the shallow grave, dusting dirt from his weathered overalls. "I had to kill the old man. I'm planting him." "You mean you killed your father?" "Yes." The sheriff's face darkened. "Open the box," he ordered one of his men. Rip leapt at them, furious. "Leave it alone," he snapped. They wrestled him down, snapping iron cuffs on his wrists. "Deuce's whelp," the sheriff muttered. "A chip off the old block." Rip snarled as they roughly tied him to his horse. "I'll kill you for this." The men chuckled grimly. They knew Rip Campbell was bad news. A boy destined to grow into a dangerous man. Chapter 2. They tried Rip for the brutal killing of his father. The trial was a mockery, a farce that no one expected to end any other way. The boy had no money, not a single cent to hire a decent attorney. No one had come to his aid, not even the few folk who had known him before the long, endless march of his father's cruelty had ruined his life. The state, in its slow, indifferent mercy, furnished him a lawyer. His name was Stearns. Stearns had been drunk for the better part of 10 or 12 years. He was a lanky, disheveled man with clothes that hung off him like they belonged to someone else, too large, too wrinkled. His unkempt hair was long and greasy, the dark strands hanging into his eyes. His nose was large, bulbous, and an unhealthy shade of purple. His small, bloodshot eyes, barely open, had a constant glazed look to them, as if he had been up for days drinking the cheapest whiskey he could find. Stearns had never been a great lawyer in his sober years, and now, sodden with alcohol, his already sluggish brain boiled in a thick haze of cheap liquor fumes. He was an embarrassment, a pitiable, pathetic figure stumbling through the trial with none of the clarity or sharpness one would expect from a defender. Rip watched him with narrowed, contemptuous eyes. He had spent the last few days in that cold, dank jail cell awaiting his trial. The days of isolation had hardened him. The cold cement and iron bars had become his home. Inside those walls, Rip had met criminals who were too eager to wise him up, teaching him how to survive in a world that had already chewed him up and spit him out. Now, here he stood, in front of a jury of 9 men and 3 women, as Stearns fumbled and slurred through the proceedings. Rip's chances were slim to none. He was defended by a half-drunk lawyer who didn't care, didn't understand, or simply didn't have the ability to mount any defense. He watched the jury, each face indifferent, inscrutable. There was no sympathy, no compassion. The state's attorney, clean and crisp in his polished suit, outlined Rip's alleged reputation for toughness. He painted him as a potential thief, a bad man, no better than his father. The attorney recited instances where Rip had been involved in cattle rustling and horse theft, each accusation more damning than the last. Rip could have shouted the truth from the rooftops, that Deuce Campbell, his father, had forced him into those crimes, that his old man had made him pack a gun from a young age, had taught him to drink, to steal, to butcher stolen beef. He could have told them that Deuce had taught him to put a brand on cattle through a wet gunny sack, to make it look aged like it belonged. His father had instilled a deep, corrupt bitterness in him, and if Rip ever made a mistake or learned too slowly, Deuce had punished him. But he couldn't say any of that. He was a prisoner now, his voice was useless. He wasn't allowed to speak the truth. Rip might have stood a fighting chance if he'd been given the opportunity to testify in his own defense, to stand up and tell the court how his father had tortured him both physically and mentally. But Stearns bungled the case beyond repair. The lawyer sat there, hunched over in his filthy, sagging suit, staring blankly at the judge, his mind clouded by the alcohol he had been sipping all day. Rip didn't even know when he was born, or what had happened to his mother. He guessed he was around 15 or 16, though age was an abstract concept to him. His memories were fragmented, none of them kind. He had no recollection of a loving mother, just Deuce, who was drunk more often than he was sober. Rip had always hated and feared his father. During the trial, Rip had a few moments of clarity, standing there on the witness stand. His voice rang out, raw and unforgiving. "He needed killing," Rip cried, his words breaking through the silence of the courtroom. "I shot him. I ain't sorry, and I'd be lying if I said I was. It was him or me, and I killed him. And if the law puts me in jail for it, then it's a hell of a law." The words came out in a rush, an avalanche of bitterness and anger that he had buried deep for years. He didn't care anymore. He had nothing left to lose. And Rip didn't stop there. He went on, his mouth spitting venom. Stearns tried to shut him up, but Rip was already on fire. His words were like daggers, sharp and unforgiving. He cursed the drunken lawyer in ways that made the three women on the jury blush. He swore at the judge, at the deputy guarding him, and at the entire court. His outburst sealed his fate, for no one was interested in the boy's truth. The jury deliberated for a scant 30 minutes, the foreman's voice cutting through the thick air when he announced the verdict. Rip stood still, his hazel eyes cold, unblinking. His mouth was a thin, tight line. There was no shock in him, no emotion, just the hollow weight of inevitability. The verdict was read, guilty of manslaughter. There was no doubt that the judge would sentence him to prison, probably for years, maybe even a lifetime. The judge spoke in a crisp, practiced voice. "From 5 to 25 years. You will serve the first part of your sentence in the state reform school. When you become of legal age, you will spend the remainder of your time in the state prison at Deer Lodge." Rip stood, his face drained of color, but his eyes, those hard, defiant eyes, never wavered. "Have you anything to say, Rip Campbell?" the judge asked, his tone cold and impartial. Rip's voice was bitter, low, and calm. "I got something to say. You and your damned laws have made me an outlaw. I'll never serve that stretch in the pen. I'll get out somehow, and when I do, I'll go the route. To hell with you, and to hell with your damned laws. Take me out of here." They led Rip back to his cell, but he didn't care. His fists clenched, his jaw tight. As they shoved him back into the cold, cemented room, he laughed, harsh and hollow. He joked with the older prisoners, mocking them with bitter humor. Stearns came to visit, but Rip didn't want his help anymore. Rip knocked the drunken lawyer to the ground with one swift motion, and then, in a burst of fury, he kicked him in the face. The jailer dragged Stearns outside, a bloody, groaning mess. "I should have killed that drunken louse," Rip muttered through clenched teeth. "That's the kind of shyster they give me when I'm on trial. That's your stinking law." Later that night, just before midnight, the deputy woke Rip from his restless sleep. "Climb into your duds, Rip. We're taking a train ride." Rip dressed in the clothes he had been given, a cheap, ill-fitting blue serge suit that had been donated by the other prisoners. He wore a worn gray flannel shirt, store-bought boots that pinched his feet, and a tie that hung loose around his neck. His hat, battered and old, had belonged to Deuce. Rip had stuffed lamp wicks behind the sweatband to make it fit his head. Outside, on the station platform, Rip gave a lopsided grin to the other prisoners who were waking up to say their goodbyes. But as the deputy cuffed him to his side, and they stood waiting for the train, Rip's heart felt like lead. His throat constricted. Hot tears welled in his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. "What's the matter, Rip?" the deputy asked, noticing the boy's brief show of weakness. Not a damn thing. Let a man alone, can't you?" Rip spat, his voice hard, hiding the tremor of emotion beneath the grit. It was Rip's first train ride. They sat in the day coach, the deputy dozing off beside him. Rip, ever the opportunist, took advantage of the moment and filled up on peanuts, candy, gum, and apples. He ate as if there was no tomorrow. Eventually, Rip asked to use the lavatory, and the deputy, still drowsy, grumbled out permission. The boy slipped away, and the deputy, thinking little of it, nodded off again. It wasn't until the train had been in motion for 20 or 30 minutes that the deputy stirred. He rubbed his eyes and checked his watch. Confused, he got up, walked over to the lavatory, and pounded on the door. "Come on out of there, kid. You sleeping in there?" No reply. Panic gripped the deputy's chest. He banged harder, shouting, but still no answer. He turned to find the conductor, and when the door finally opened, it was empty. Rip had escaped. The deputy's rage was boiling now. He got off at the next station, hired a horse, and raced back along the tracks, searching the hills and valleys for the boy. He would find him, he swore. But by morning, Rip was nowhere to be found. Chapter 3. Rip, crawling through the lavatory window, hung by his hands from the windowsill. The train rushed through the black night. The wind roared in his ears. The wheels clicked over the rails. Clickety-click. Clickety-click. Below was blackness. His nerves were taut, stretched like fiddle strings pulled too tightly. He wanted to crawl back into the safety of the coach. His heart pounded in his throat. Fear gripped him with a cold hand, crushing his breath. He hung by his hands, his feet groping in vain for a hold on the smooth side of the railway coach. Then, with a gasp like a drowning swimmer, his fingers let go. Perhaps he screamed as he fell. There was that horrible fear of falling beneath the wheels of the rushing train. Terror gripped him. With a terrific force, he hit the ground. It was like being hurled from the mouth of a cannon. Face and hands torn by cinders, he rolled over and over down the steep embankment. He slammed into a barbed wire fence. His head collided with a post, and he was knocked senseless. It was breaking day when he regained consciousness. His head was splitting. His face and hands were cut and bleeding. His clothes were ripped to rags. But he was free. He tried to stand, then sank back to the ground with a groan. His right leg was broken just below the knee. Rip lay there, his body bathed in cold sweat. He chewed on his coat sleeve to keep from crying out in pain. Then he crawled, dragging his broken leg through the tall grass toward some willow thickets lining the riverbank 100 yards away. That would be Milk River, he reckoned. If he could only make it to an Indian camp or a rancher's place, he'd make some kind of a deal to have his legs set and hide out until he could move on. He reached the riverbank and drank some of the cold water. Then he bathed his swollen leg, hoping to ease the pain that made him sick to his stomach. He fainted 2 or 3 times. The pain was getting worse. He was shivering from the cold. His old Mackinaw coat was left on the train. It was cold, and it looked like snow. He tried to set his leg, but the pain made him vomit. He lay there on the ground, head pillowed in his arms, teeth grinding to keep back the sobs. He was shivering from cold, yet the pain made him sweat. His vision swam and blackened. His leg ached and throbbed. It was almost noon when the big deputy, following Rip's trail, found him on the riverbank. Rip tried to grin, though his face was pale and his teeth chattered. "I'm licked, looks like," he managed to say. The big deputy wrapped the boy in his overcoat and made Rip drink some whiskey he had brought. That was a low-down, ornery trick I pulled, admitted Rip. You were nice to me, and I done you dirty. I had this tough luck coming to me. Take another slug of whiskey. Then keep wrapped up in that coonskin coat. I'm going after a rig to take you to the hospital. Hang tough, boy. You've got guts. I'll tough it out, gritted Rip. Take your time going, but hit a run coming back. I'll manage. Rip did manage. The big deputy returned with a buckboard, and they loaded Rip onto a mattress, covering him with blankets. At the hospital in town, they set Rip's leg. His face and hands healed quickly, and by the second day, Rip began to enjoy hospital life. Gosh, he told the white-clad nurse with the Irish eyes, this is cleaner than anything, ain't it? She had cheeks as red as apples and jet-black hair. I'll have you scrubbed clean, if it takes every scouring brush in the place. Look at those hands. I'm cutting your hair tomorrow. She was the first woman Rip had talked to much. It took him a few days to get over being bashful when she bathed him and cared for him. But she joshed him, called him Jesse James and Billy the Kid, and treated him like a cowboy. She'd been raised on a ranch and married to a cowpuncher, so she knew how to talk to him. In no time, they were friends. The doctor, a blunt-spoken countryman always chewing on a cold cigar, joked a lot too. He told Rip he'd make him a wooden leg if needed. It was the first kindness Rip had ever found in life. A lump formed in his throat when the nurse placed flowers on the table beside his cot, and the doctor brought him a sack of apples. Even the big deputy, despite being chewed out for letting Rip escape, brought him candy and a mouth harp. That roan horse that belonged to Deuce, Rip told the deputy. I won't be needing him. He's yours. You've been mighty good to me. I'll make you out a bill of sale. He liked the big deputy, the nurse, and the old doctor. He was sorry when the time came to go to reform school. The nurse kissed him and cried when he left. The doctor blew his nose and swore softly. Hobbling on crutches, Rip boarded the train with the deputy, heading to reform school to start a 25-year sentence behind prison walls. Those few hospital weeks were the only soft ones Rip would know for a long time. When the deputy shook hands and turned him over to the reform school authorities, bitterness and hatred for the law returned. At first, Rip fought the new discipline behind high walls. He was kept in a cell like a jail cell. When he struck a guard with a crutch, they treated him like a hardened criminal. Reforms hadn't reached institutions yet, and the teachers used rough methods. One heavy-set, bull-necked teacher swung a rubber hose over his fists. He beat Rip unconscious twice in the first 2 weeks. Other punishments included the water cure, or stringing boys by their thumbs until they passed out. This burly red-haired man was called Big Mo. Rip spent most of his first 2 weeks in solitary until he met Hank, the oldest boy in the reformatory. Tall, muscled, and cunning, Hank led the boys. He was serving time for highway robbery and planned to end up in state's prison. Hank, a trusty working in the commissary, sized up Rip, who limped with a cane. Rip met Hank's yellow-eyed scrutiny without flinching. Got any dough on you? Hank asked. No. Not a dime. Hank handed over a shirt and overalls. These don't fit, Rip said, shoving them back. Hank sneered. That's what you get. Don't like it? How about a crack on the jaw? You'll give me the right size, Rip said quietly, or I'll climb over and take them. Hank lunged. Rip swung his cane, dropping Hank. Rip climbed over, grabbed what he needed, and waited for Hank to wake. When Hank stirred, Rip grinned. Come at me again, and I'll knock you cold. Hank chuckled grimly. You'll do, kid. What's your name? Rip Campbell. What kind of name is that? Rip studied the big boy. The kind I got. Are you a rough guy? Hank moved in closer. Rip could feel his hot breath on his cheek. Hank was taller than he was, wider too, and for a moment even tough. Rip knew he would give a good fight if called on, that winning might not be easy. Or even possible. "What are you in for?" Hank looked Rip up and down. "Doing a manslaughter charge." "Tough guy, huh? Who'd you croak?" "My old man. Always drunk. Always beating me. Had it coming." They shook hands, and Hank respected Rip's grit. From then on, they were partners. Chapter 4. The night was dark. A 20-foot drop stretched from the dormitory window to the ground. The bars on the window had been cut with hacksaw blades and wrenched apart by Hank's big hands. They had made a rope out of their blankets. The other boys in the dormitory lay pretending to be asleep, aware that Hank and Rip were making their escape. It was close to midnight. They reckoned Big Mo was on guard in the yard below. He held the keys to the outer gate. To get free, they needed the gate or would have to climb the wall. For nearly a year, Hank had looked for a way over the wall, but it was too high and smooth. The gate was the only option. A 20-foot slide down the blanket rope into the yard, hoping Big Mo would be asleep when they jumped him. Big Mo carried a .45 six-shooter and a blackjack. He was big and tough. "But," Hank said, "he told me today he sat up nearly all last night in a stud game. He'll be 2/3 drunk tonight and maybe sound asleep. Still, he'll fight. I'm his meal ticket here, kid. I'm the only paying customer. Listen, Rip, when you slide down the rope, stay quiet in the dark. I'll be down when you shake the rope to signal me. Just jiggle it, and I'll slip down like a fireman on a greased pole. Then we take on Big Mo. Ready, kid? Let's go." Rip went first, climbing hand over hand. Against the brick wall, the darkness covered him. His feet touched the ground, under a black night promising snow. He jiggled the rope, and Hank came sliding down. Together, they pressed against the wall in the dark. Snow began swirling into the yard light. Big Mo, wrapped in a muffler, coonskin coat, overshoes, and blanket-lined overalls, sat huddled against the gate. Hank slipped Rip one of 2 butcher knives. Now they stood shivering in the cold, watching the huddled figure of Big Mo. "For 6 months," Hank whispered, "that son of a gun kept me in a lousy cell. The bread he gave me was full of worms. The water was alkali he brought from out of town. He's been shaking me down for dough. I still wear marks from his beatings, 5 trips to the hospital because of him. I've bribed him for 2 years. If he kills me, Rip, promise me you'll cut his heart out." Rip nodded. "I'll handle my end, Hank." Big Mo was half asleep, but it was too cold to sleep heavily. He woke suddenly as Hank rushed him. Mo's gun hung from his overcoat pocket, but Hank's butcher knife slashed through fur and flannel to flesh. Hank laughed, a crazy, bitter laugh. Big Mo's gun spat fire. Hank slashed his wrist to the bone, then dropped him with a hard punch. Hank pocketed the guard's gun. "It's over." Hank grinned at Rip from his kneeling position beside the bleeding guard. He didn't believe in banks. "I got his roll, kid. Here are his keys. Open the gate, fast. Hell, they'll be after us in a—" Rip unlocked the big iron gate. Together, they sprinted down the street. Behind them, the commotion rose from Big Mo's gunfire. Hank led Rip into an alley and then a small barn. In the light of a match cupped in his hand, Hank revealed 2 saddled horses. "Pays to have friends outside, kid. There's a belt and gun on your saddle horn, a carbine in the scabbard, meat, bread, and whiskey in the saddle pockets. Let's go." They left town at a high run. Their grain-fed horses were hard and fast. The night was black and stormy. Hank knew the country, and no darkness could hide the trails from his sharp eyes. He glanced back often, checking on Rip and the horizon. No one's coming. Want a drink of whiskey? No thanks. My old man drank enough for 10 of us. All the more for me. Now, let me have your undershirt. My undershirt? Yeah. Big Mo put a slug through my arm. It's bleeding, but he won't be pulling another trigger. You got him? Ripped him wide open. Here's how. Rip listened as Hank expounded on his skill at shooting. He kept expounding as they rode. How he was good at horse riding and roping and shooting and killing, just about better than any man out there. You sure were lucky hitching your wagon to me, Hank slurred, sounding an awful lot like Deuce to Rip. We get into some kind of trouble. Don't you worry about it, Hank kept on. I'll get us out. No sheriff alive could track them in the stormy night. Snow swirled thick as they pushed their horses through the black, heads bent against the wind. It was the first of many nights they'd ride with death close behind. 2 weeks later, on stolen horses, they rode into a Wyoming town in a heavy snowstorm. They hitched their horses in front of a saloon. The deserted, blizzard-swept street was empty, save for the occasional hurried figure bundled in fur, rushing through the storm. Inside the saloon, they thawed out by a stove, warming themselves with whiskey. The bartender, an old cowhand, welcomed them with a smile, friendly chatter, and a bottle. Leaving, boys? He asked as they buttoned their coats. Just getting back in circulation, Hank said, taking a quart with him. So long. They walked to a small bank, snow gusting in behind them. 2 men in the bank barely noticed the strangers until Hank and Rip pulled their 6-shooters. The young outlaws smiled grimly, Hank's yellow eyes sharp and dangerous. We need some green, gents, Hank said. It's your ante. Try any tricks and we'll gut shoot you. Make it fast. Rip stuffed cash into a gunny sack while Hank kept them covered. Minutes later, they were riding out of town into the storm, heading east toward fresh horses hidden in an old cattle shed. Easy pickings. Them dudes were scared stiff. Have a drink. Rip took a small sip, hating the taste but grateful for the warmth. They rode until nightfall, then camped in scrub timber, huddling in fur coats and chaps. They didn't dare light a fire. Snow drifted over them like a blanket. Occasionally, they stood to stamp their feet and restore circulation. Bet my feet are frozen, Hank grumbled. My face sure is, Rip added, and my hands are stiff. But we ain't in jail, kid. That's right, Hank. We're free. Chapter 5. Rip and Hank rode on through the storm. Rip knew that back at the cabin, he had left a man who had become his friend. Even as he knew that he now was the enemy of the yellow-eyed Hank. Hank was the kind that never forgave a quarrel, never forgot a grudge. He'd have to watch Hank from now on. That first quarrel at the reformatory commissary was still in Hank's craw. Rip knew that. This second run-in settled it. Hank was laying to kill him now. It might be tonight or next year or 10 years from now, but Hank would be sure to try it. Hank'd wait till the sign was right because, deep down in his killer's heart, he was afraid of Rip. Rip watched him covertly as they rode into the blizzard. He saw that the yellow eyes were brooding and sullen. Hank had been the big bully at the reformatory. He had been the king there. Younger and smaller boys had been made to pay tribute in some form or another. Rip had been the only one to defy Hank. Rip reckoned that maybe Hank had killed Big Mo just to show the younger boy that he could be tough. Hank had ridden broncos for the Bear Paw Pool when he was 16. He was tough and ornery. He wanted to be tough. He aimed to be as tough as any man that ever rode the Outlaw Trail. But he was afraid of Rip Campbell's cool courage. Rip knew that, and he had the sense to know that a coward is always far more dangerous than a brave man. Hank would kill him if he got the right chance. On the other hand, Lip Harding of Wyoming had become Rip's friend. He knew about the Harding outfit. J.T. Harding was a power in Wyoming politics. He could have been United States Senator, but chose not to take any prominent part in the political game. He liked the rough life of the cowboy and spent most of his time on his ranch. An old-timer in that country, he was known all over the state. Lip Harding, old J.T.'s son, might someday prove to be a valuable friend. Not that Rip cared much. Rip's way was the crooked trail of the outlaw pack. He could not afford to make friends with any man. To ride with them, drink with them, rob with them, perhaps kill with them, that was one thing. But to make a friend of any man, good or bad, was not in Rip's manner of reckoning. There was something about Lip Harding that made Rip admire him a lot. For one thing, Lip Harding had faced Hank like a man. He hadn't crawled on his belly to Hank, even when he figured that Hank was aiming to kill him. Lip Harding was no man's yellow-bellied coyote. Like as not, he had book learning too. J.T.'s son would have everything that money could buy. But still, he was there at a lonely line camp eating beans and biscuits and beef, and shoveling hay to poor cattle. Old J.T. was worth all kinds of money, but it was money that he'd worked hard for. He had been up and down plenty many times. He had been broke and hungry and in need of a friend, but he was worth a plenty now. And it hadn't added on to the size of his hatband either. He shaved when his whiskers got to itchin', and he wore the kind of clothes he was used to. And he was probably bringing up his son along the same lines he had traveled. Lip Harding was all right. He was old J.T.'s son and a chip off the old block. But Rip figured that Lip's trail and Rip Campbell's trail went in opposite directions. Lip Harding was the son of a big millionaire cowman. Rip Campbell's trail was the crooked trail to hell. Hank squinted through the driving snow at Rip. There was an ugly grin on his mouth, and his yellow eyes glittered like the eyes of some predatory animal. "You should have let me kill that gent back yonder, Rip." "Why, Hank?" "There'll be a posse following us. They'll hit his camp, and he'll put them on our trail." "Think so, Hank?" "Listen here, kid. You can't play this game with white chips. You got to go the whole route." "He fed us, Hank. I'd feel like a crawling snake if I killed a man that had taken me in out of a snowstorm and fed me." "You'd rather let him squeal on us and get us killed." Rip pulled up his horse. His hazel eyes looked almost gray in the storm. "Hank, we might as well settle her here. I ain't killing men that never hurt me. I ain't killing a man that ain't packing a gun. That goes as she lays. If she don't lay good, try out your luck. I take nothing off you or any man. I'm in this game to the limit, but I reckon a man can play this kind of a hand without murdering men that ain't healed. I'm as game as you are. If my way don't suit, let's settle the deal now. I'll fight you or I'll split the trails right here and now. Only for me, you'd be doing time, kid." "I'm remembering that, Hank. We started out together. It ain't sensible to be jangling." "No, it ain't sensible, Hank. I never started it. You done picked the argument." "I reckon you're right, Rip. Only I think something of my scalp, and I know that cowboy back yonder will squeal on us." "What'll you bet?" grinned Rip, seeing Hank's eyes lose their menace. 100? "Make her 500. Rip still grinned. "Called. How'll you prove it?" "You ride on, Hank. I'll stay here on the trail somewhere and wait. If I don't show up at camp tomorrow, you can keep the $500 I'll give you now. If I show up tomorrow at noon at that cabin we're heading for at the hole in the wall, you pay me back that 500 and 500 more. Is that fair?" "Fair enough, kid. Only you can't forget that we're in this hide-and-find game together. What kind of a damn skunk do you think I am to leave a man in a tight like that?" This was an angle to Hank's character that Rip had never seen. It was a part of the yellow-eyed Hank's own weird code. Hank was no doubt planning on killing Rip sometime, somewhere. But he would not leave him to be killed by any posse. They were still a lot of miles from the hole in the wall country. Between there and where they now sat their saddles was some dangerous territory to cross. Behind them was a posse. "If that's your way of quitting me, Rip," said Hank, "you don't need to pay me off with 500 lousy bucks. We started together. We are going to finish together. That betting goes, but if you stay here on the open trail, I'm staying with you. I'll collect when that fool posse catches up. You're hurt, Hank. You need a warm place to sleep and a decent bandage on that bullet hole. I reckon we can manage to find out if that cowboy double-crossed us. Somebody can find out." Somehow, Rip could not help but liking this yellow-eyed killer. Hank had been man enough to stick in a tight. That was something. A lot of gents would have let a boy take his chances alone. But not Hank. They rode on together. On through the blizzard that swept the country. Each of them kept a silent tongue. Twice they stopped, and Rip wrapped new bandages around Hank's wound. These bandages were cut from Rip's undershirt. The dusk made travel hard in the storm. Both of the young outlaws were badly frostbitten and numb from the bitter cold. Just before dark, they hit a deserted line camp and put up their horses in the log barn. There was grub in the cabin and plenty of wood. Rip built a fire in the stove, and they cooked supper. The heat of the cabin stung their frostbitten faces, and that bullet hole in Hank's left arm was in bad shape. But there was no word of complaint from either. After the supper dishes were washed, they sat around and smoked. Hank was uneasy and nervous, and seemed to be listening for some noise outside the cabin. The blizzard was still on, and the wind moaned like something alive. "Expecting company, Hank?" asked Rip. He had been watching the other wonderingly for some time. "There's a posse on our trail, kid, and don't let that fact slip out of your skull for 1 minute. There'll be men in that posse that know where this cabin is located. It'll be hard to find on a night like this. We're just as safe as if we was in jail. It's the fever in that bullet wound that's got you jumpy. If you'd let me kill that cowboy back yonder, we'd stand a show. But I tell you, they're a-following us. If they put out that candle, kid, they're coming." Chapter 6. Outside in the snow-swept night, a horse nickered. Another horse nickered back. Hank sloshed a pail of snow water on the fire. The cabin was now in utter darkness. "Now," gritted Hank, "let them come. And I'll live to get back and shoot that blabbing cowboy in the belly. You owe me 500 simoleons, partner." Rip made no reply. He gripped his carbine tightly, peering through a hole he had scratched and dug out of the chinking between the logs. Hank crouched on the opposite side of the cabin, squinting through a similar hole. The last faint red glow of the fire showed his narrowed yellow eyes gleaming in the dark like a panther's. Rip wondered if Hank really could see in the darkness. A heavy bar had been slid across the door. They had the advantage of warmth over the men surrounding the cabin. Hank moved slightly, shoving the barrel of his carbine through his porthole. He jerked the trigger, and from outside came the quick, gasping moan of a man badly hit. Rip could see nothing in the black, snow-filled night. It was so dark, he couldn't see his hand in front of his face. From out in the black storm came a volley of shots. The one window in the cabin shattered. 1 or 2 bullets ripped through the door. Rip shot at random, without hope of hitting anything. He could hear men calling to one another. Hank fired deliberately, his gun taking deadly toll. The wind moaned like a dirge. Some heavy object thudded against the door. Hank and Rip emptied their guns at the door. They heard a man cursing heavily. The thudding impact quit. No doubt the posse had tried to use a corral pole as a battering ram. A menacing voice shouted from outside. "You two might as well give up. There's plenty of us. We'll take you dead or alive." "There's two of us," Hank called back tauntingly. "We're nice and warm in here, fighting on full bellies. How'd you like a good hot cup of coffee?" "You want us so bad," added Rip. "Why don't you walk in and get us?" The posse made a second rush with their battering ram. The two outlaws riddled the door with slugs. Hank whirled and shot at the window. A man outside screamed in agony. "I think," said Hank, "I got that one in the neck. That snow keeps me from seeing good." "Can you really see in the dark, Hank?" "As good as a tomcat, kid." Hank liked to blow and brag. Rip had never heard of any man who could see in the dark. Yet Hank picked off men in that inky blackness with the same accuracy he had in daylight. It suddenly occurred to Rip that when Hank got ready to kill him, it would be on a moonless night. Hank would use his advantage. They kept shooting at the door, which was but a blurred shadow. The battering ram quit. Silence fell, broken only by the moaning of wounded men. "How do you like it out west?" taunted Hank. "As far as you've been?" The voice from the storm called again, now without menace. "You win, boys. I've got some wounded men out here. They'll die if they don't get inside. Any chance to make a deal?" "What do you take us for?" snarled Hank. "Think we care about a bunch of law dogs trying to kill us? Guess again, Johnny Law." There was a long pause. Rip could hear the sheriff talking to his men. "There's 5 wounded," called the sheriff. "Let them in with the doctor. I'll give you my word, the rest of us will head back for town at daylight." "Do you get those jokes out of the Arkansas Traveler?" jeered Hank. "Your horses are in the shed," called the sheriff. "Suppose I take them and set you two afoot. I can gather 50 men eager to follow your tracks. Think that over." Rip and Hank knew the sheriff spoke the truth. The storm would cover the range with drifts. It was still a long way to the hole in the wall. Afoot, they'd be doomed. "It's a horse on us, Hank. Anyhow, I hate hearing those poor devils give up. What'll we do? Cut their throats with that dull butcher knife in the cupboard. We'll take our chances, kid. Don't weaken. If they set us afoot, Hank, we're goners. That sheriff has an ace in the hole." "Kid," said Hank grimly, "you'll never make a real outlaw. You weaken too quick. We hired out as tough hands. Are you going to play your string out?" "I don't hanker to start out afoot in this snow. It's fool's play. That sheriff is offering a fair deal. If we don't take it, we're fools. That sheriff is trying to trap us. He has hurt men who'll die if we don't let them in. If it were me, I'd chance it. Kid, you'll never get anywhere if you don't change your thinking. A sheriff's a sheriff. To hell with those wounded men. They lost. Let them die." Hank's voice was harsh. Outside, the wind whipped around the cabin and drove snow through the broken window. Rip heard a wounded man begging for death. His stomach knotted. He wanted to help the poor devil. Hank whistled through his teeth. Rip made up his mind. "I'm making a deal with the sheriff." "Just what do you mean, kid?" Hank's voice cut through the darkness. "Just what I said, Hank. It's our one chance. If we don't take it, we're afoot in nowhere with snow belly deep to a tall camel. We'll be double-crossed, kid. We'll chance it, Hank. It's our one bet." Hank studied him in the dark. Rip wondered if Hank would kill him. Seconds felt like hours. "Kid," said Hank, "you've got a long head. I half think we should gamble on your hunch. But before we unbar that door, we need a safeguard. Got any ideas? 1. The window's busted, ain't it? Plenty busted, kid. Then let the sheriff crawl through it. He gives himself up first. If they try tricks, we kill him. Sounds solid? Hank chuckled darkly. Great stuff, kid. Holler out your deal. Rip explained to the sheriff. After a silence, the sheriff replied in his deep drawling voice. I'll take that deal. The sheriff broke the glass shards on the window with his Winchester barrel and crawled in. He stood by the window, breathing audibly. Hold your hands behind your back, gritted Hank. How can you tell where my hands are? I can, that's all, said Hank with grim humor. Your right hand's on your gun. Your left's on the windowsill. What kind of eyes have you got? Cat. Chapter 7. Those men who were unhurt found a sort of shelter in the shed. They built a big fire and squatted around it. Inside the cabin were Rip, Hank, the manacled sheriff, 5 wounded men, and the doctor. Hank had disarmed every man that came in, whole or wounded, and had tossed their guns out into the snowdrift. The sheriff lay on his side, his wrists handcuffed to a pole upright that ran from floor to ceiling as a support for the double bunk in the cabin. He was a gray-mustached man with deeply tanned skin and blue eyes. He said little as he lay there on the floor, helpless. There was, after all, little to say. Rip made a fire in the stove and heated water. The doctor was a young fellow, not much older than Hank. He had an easy way about him and took things as a matter of course. Rip liked the doctor and helped him bathe and dress the wounds of the suffering men who lay on the floor. Hank sat back in a corner, his yellow eyes brooding, his hands near his guns. He said nothing to Rip about helping the doctor, but he knew that his outlaw companion took this act of decency as a sort of weakness. The sheriff's blue eyes studied Rip and Hank. He was a veteran peace officer, and part of his job was to size men up. How did you know so certain that you'd be finding us here? Hank asked the sheriff. I figured that if you two didn't make this cabin, you'd freeze to death somewhere. We come past a line camp, Hank went on. There was a cowboy there. Did he put you on our trail? You mean Lip Harding, I reckon. That's his name, put in Rip. We come past Lip's camp, but we got nothing out of him. I knew you had passed that way, and I asked Lip which direction you'd gone. He said that he was right sorry, but I couldn't get no information from him. When I asked him why, he said that one of you two would-be outlaws had saved his life. I didn't ask him no more questions because I figured Lip wouldn't talk. Lip Harding never put me on your trail. I know this country fairly well, having ridden it for 50 years. I knew you'd either be here or buried somewhere in the snow by morning if you missed the cabin in the storm. I reckon, sneered Hank, that you'd lie anyhow to protect this Harding gent. Protect Lip Harding? A slow smile widened the sheriff's mouth. Lip don't need protecting from such snakes as you, young fellow. Give Lip a gun, and he'll handle his own end. Hank nodded briefly toward the wounded men. We was 2 against your whole damned posse. Neither of us got a scratch, but your men look kind of banged up to me. I reckon that proves we can take care of our scalps. Your Lip Harding could do as good, you think? Hank grinned crookedly at the sheriff, his head nodding. I'm admitting I don't know how you picked so many of us off. Luck, I reckon, or them nasty eyes of yours can see in the dark. Hank grinned crookedly. It wasn't luck. The sheriff's head must be hurting him, but he voiced not one word of complaint. I hope that someday, he said bluntly, I get the chance to throw you in prison and lose the key. Hank's grin became a sneer. How do you know you'll ever get out of this cabin alive? I don't know. You'd be snaky enough to do murder all right. Are you trying to build up a bad representative? I aim to make a special job of killing sheriffs, bragged Hank with that toughness of youth that wants to be known as a real gunslinging bad man. The boasting made the grizzled sheriff smile faintly. He was fully aware that this young braggart was a dangerous sort of character. Hank had that heedless recklessness of youth. He feared few things, and hid whatever fear he did have behind a grin and a snarl and a pair of yellow slit eyes. Given the right breaks, Hank would certainly become plenty tough. He would be treacherous and without mercy. The sheriff turned his gaze toward Rip, who was helping the doctor probe for a bullet in a man's back. Rip had a clean-cut face. His jaw was firm, his forehead high, and his eyes were steady gazing. Lip Harding had briefly related the incident at his cabin when Rip had saved him from being killed by Hank. The sheriff was a man with grown sons of his own. He thought to himself that this young outlaw had the makings of a man if he had been given a chance. Rip bathed the ugly wound in the suffering man's back. The poor devil lay there gritting his teeth and wincing when the probe went into the bullet hole. Now Rip, wearing a pair of rubber gloves the doctor had made him put on, was handling a small, shiny instrument. Sort of a clamp or long-pointed pliers. "All right now," said the doctor to him. "Just be ready when I get this. That's the ticket. Good work. You'd make a surgeon, my outlaw friend." Somehow, Rip felt all warm inside at this bit of faint praise. Now, he and the doctor were bandaging and fastening pads of gauze and dressings with strips of adhesive. "You'll be going in for preaching next, kid," sneered Hank. But Rip paid him no heed. He was peeling off the rubber gloves and getting the blood off his arms. He doctor was giving the wounded men hypodermic injections to ease their pain. Rip had been fascinated by this work of caring for wounded men. He wished that he was that cool, pleasant-mannered young doctor who, despite his youth, was so efficient. The sheriff asked for a smoke, and Rip rolled him one. The veteran peace officer thanked him. "Quit herding with that young snake there," he told Rip, indicating Hank. "And you might turn out to be a man and do something besides pull a gun trigger." Hank snarled something under his breath. Rip shook his head. "Can't quit now, Sheriff. No turning back now. I'd a heap rather be killed than serve that 25-year stretch that they handed me. I aimed to go straight. But damn them, they won't give a kid a chance to try his hand. I'll string my bets with Hank." Chapter 8. The world was still, blanketed under a thick layer of snow, untouched and glistening like a field of diamonds. The blizzard had swept through the night, draping everything in a frosty white coat. As dawn began its slow ascent, the first light peeked over the horizon, casting a soft, rosy glow that illuminated the landscape with a harsh glow. The air was crisp, and carried with it the fresh scent of pine mingling with the earthy aroma of wet soil beneath the snow. Shadows began to stretch and shift, as sunlight filtered through branches weighed down by their wintry load. The trees stood tall, their boughs heavy, dusted with fresh powder that sparkled like fresh icing on a cake. The sky transitioned from deep navy to hues of lavender and peach, painting a perfect backdrop for this peaceful awakening. The posse quit the shelter of the shed and rode away. They had brought but little grub, so they started out empty, cold, and uncomfortable, though the storm had let up, and the sun was trying to break through a gray sky. Rip saddled his horse and Hank's. Hank unlocked the handcuffs that had rubbed the sheriff's wrists until they bled. "Your posse has gone. There's a dead stiff there in the shed that they left behind. Try to follow us, and it will be to your sorrow, not ours. So long." "I'll land you behind bars yet," promised the sheriff. Hank leered at him, his yellow eyes mocking this old veteran of the law trails. For a long moment, the old sheriff and the young outlaw eyed one another. Then Hank backed out the door, his hand on his gun. "Come on, Rip," he said to the younger outlaw as Rip stood there in the cabin. The doctor held out his hand to Rip. "I won't forget how you helped me. I'd have been badly handicapped otherwise." Rip shook hands awkwardly. He hated any sort of demonstration like that. It made him feel foolish. He had started to follow Hank when the tall sheriff halted him with an outstretched hand. "Sorry, son, that you started off on the wrong trail. I hope I'll never have to swap shots with you. If ever a play comes up that you can quit this game, do so. The best you can expect is the worst of it. Ask the oldest old-timer you meet up with when you reach the hole in the wall. See what he says." "Say, cut out this damn sermon stuff," snarled Hank. "What do you think this is, a church? Come on, Rip, or else stay here and let the law take you back and throw you in a solitary cell and feed you on dry, moldy bread and water. Let's be dragging it, kid, or else let's split here." "I'm coming, Hank, but I ain't coming till I get ready. You ain't my keeper." Hank stepped outside and into the saddle of his waiting horse. He sat his horse with admirable ease, though the big gelding was humped up and snuffy. Now the horse sank its head and with a squeal commenced pitching. Hank, grinning, rode him easily. He raked the buck out of the big gelding and came back at a trot. Rip left the cabin and mounted his horse. Rip's horse was more gentle and made no attempt to buck. He looked back over his shoulder at the cabin they were leaving. He saw the sheriff standing there in the doorway. Rip saw him wave and waved back. Hank noticed the exchange of greetings and sneered in an ugly way. "You forgot to kiss the John Law goodbye, kid. Hell, you'll never go the outlaw route the way you're acting." "No." Rip smiled a little. When he smiled, his eyes puckered a little. "Think not, Hank. Not if you're going to be throwing in with the law. The big gents we'll meet at the hole in the wall wouldn't treat you so good if the story was to get out that you and the sheriff back yonder are partners, handshaking and so on, and that he's reforming you. Know what they do to a man they think is too friendly with the Johnny Law folks. Quit beefing. Hank, you know I ain't any dirty stool pigeon that will turn a man into the law. Forget it. They'd kill you in a second if they thought you was around nursing wounded lawmen and shaking hands with sheriffs." "Then," said Rip grimly, "I reckon they'll have to kill me." Another something to add to the breach between Rip and Hank. Hank acted sullen, and they rode for hours without talking. They were traveling as fast as the drifts permitted. The country kept getting rougher. Late that evening, Rip and Hank made the hole in the wall. Hank had certain messages that passed them into that colony of hunted men. Here was safety from the law. Hank looked up a man he used to work with when he broke broncos from the Bearpaw cattle pool in Montana. The cowpuncher greeted Hank with a reserved sort of manner. He shook hands with Rip, and they had some drinks together from the cowpuncher's jug, then got supper. Rip thought that this ex-cowboy didn't care any too much for Hank. Still, you never can tell. Sometimes the man that falls all over you trying to show how good a friend he is will be the man that will shoot you where your suspenders cross. The quiet kind are more likely to mean what they say. They met other men there at the hole in the wall. Cold-eyed, grim-lipped men who talked but little and watched the two youthful outlaws with eyes that were a little suspicious. Rip was the youngest of the outlaws who were there now. He felt like a kid, and they treated him with an indifference that made him feel out of place and awkward. He was worn out and sleepy, but he reckoned it would look like he was a weakling if he said anything about it. He wondered where he would locate a bed. Hank was getting drunk. He was in a stud poker game with some gents. For all his pretense at sophistication and toughness, and his boasting about what a slick gambler he was, Hank was losing. Rip reckoned that maybe Hank was too drunk to know his cards good. Rip sat in a corner alone, reading an old magazine by the light of a smoky lamp. He felt alone and isolated. These were all grown men, hardened to every bit of the outlaw game. They drank whiskey and gambled and cussed and told some pretty bad stories and bragged about women they had known here and there between the Argentine and the Klondike. Their talk was coarse, their habits free and loose. But Rip was not unused to all this. Back home, his old man had trailed with a tough gang. Deuce liked cards and whiskey and the women of the dance halls. Rip was finding nothing new in the way of wickedness here. But his youth shut him away from the older men. He was just a kid, an unlicked cub. They were men. Tough men. Men who had been all over the country. Alaska or Mexico were alike to these men who drifted up and down the Outlaw Trail. They were men who had killed and robbed. They were actually tough. While Rip felt himself just an outsider, uninvited here, unwanted. Once they had supper, and Rip had washed the dishes. Hank had plumb ignored him. Hank, flushed with vain pride at this first contact with seasoned outlaws, seemed to forget all about Rip. Rip could hear Hank brag about knifing Big Mo at the reform school and holding up the bank. He bragged about their fight at the deserted line camp and how many men he had shot. The older men listened to Hank's drunken bragging and said but little. The jobs they had done, the men they had killed, they made no mention of. They had seen others like Hank. Perhaps not so many years ago, they had also talked as Hank was talking now, spilling a lot of bragging talk so that he might be accepted into this nameless fraternity of the damned. Hank talked on. They listened. Now and then, a pair of eyes slid a cold glance toward the corner of the bunkhouse where the beardless boy Rip sat sleepily with his battered magazine. A big man with grizzled white hair and a white stubble of beard on his big square jaw cashed in his chips. Rip had noticed that this big man, whose name he had not heard, neither drank nor smoked. He sat there at the poker table, a match in a corner of his mouth, his steady black eyes missing nothing. The big man swapped his chips for cash from the big one-eyed gent who was running the game. He pushed back his chair and left the game. He walked over to where Rip sat. He looked down at the boy with the unfathomable black eyes that were partly hidden under the heaviest iron-gray brows the boy had ever seen. "Ain't it about your bedtime, young feller?" Rip met the big man's scrutiny. "I reckon it is. I ain't much of a hand to set up late." And how many men did you help your partner kill?" Rip felt his face getting hot. "I don't know. I reckon Hank done most of the killing. It was plumb dark and snowin'. But Hank can see in the dark. Better have a little nip at the jug, son." I'd a heap rather not. It makes me feel silly. I ain't much of a hand to drink. The old man kinda sickened me on the notion." "He preached at you, you mean?" "No, sir. He used to make me drink till I couldn't stand on my feet. Then he was always thinking there was snakes in his boots. When I busted a jug, the last jug of liquor he had me still, he come at me and I had to kill him." The big man sat down on the edge of a bunk. "Tell me about it, Button." Rip saw that heavy square face smile, and found himself smiling back. Then, warmed by that smile, Rip talked as he had never before talked to any man in his life. He told about those pinched, bitter, terrible years with his old man. How his old man had taught him to be ornery. How he had made Rip steal and make whiskey and lie. How, when his old man was dead, he had aimed to ride that roan gelding into a new life where he could get a job with some cow outfit and lead an honest life. Then, they had given him 25 years in prison. Rip told how he met Hank and how they had broken out of the reform school. Then about the bank robbery and the fight in the cabin. About the doctor and the sheriff and how Hank had taunted him for being weak. especially when Hank had wanted to kill Lip Harding. The big man chewed on his match and listened. His black eyes watched the boy's every expression. And when Rip was done talking, they sat there for a long time without talking. Hank was winning a little now, over at the stud game, and was still bragging. The big man jerked a thumb toward the poker game. Aiming to keep on with that kid, Hank. There ain't anything else to do, far as I can see. He'll hang someday if he don't get shot. You say that sheriff advised you to go somewhere and start different? Yes, sir. Why don't you? Came the blunt question. Rip looked at this big outlaw, whose name he did not know. He met the big man's question squarely. It's too late. There's too much on the law books against me. I gotta play my string out. The big man smiled, as if he were recalling some far-distant memory. What's your name, son? Rip. Rip Campbell. The big man's black eyes narrowed a little. He was looking hard at the boy now. Camp. Bell, you say? Rip nodded. Yes, sir. And you? You call me Wolverine when you're ready to call me anything. I used to be a marshal. Rip blinked in surprise. His jaw dropped. Wolverine. No foolin'. The man nodded. I got tired of shootin' men that wouldn't stay down. I was a lawman when I had to be one. Now, I got to be a different kind. Maybe I'll help you out someday. Rip felt a weight lift from his shoulders. You mean you're for me then? He asked. The big man's eyes smiled. Sure. You got a raw deal. But you'll make out better than you think. The storm had stopped, and the stars were starting to come out. Let's get you set up with a bed, boy. You're done for tonight. Chapter 9. Rip handed over the money without a question. There was something quietly compelling about the big man's manner. He smiled at Rip and put the money in his pocket. Putting back that money, Rip, and lending Lip Harding a hand that way, and helping out them wounded men, all that is going to help you later. It might be that J.T. Harding can do something for you up in Montana, so that they'll give you a new trial. J.T. has plenty of influence, and he'll go through hell for a friend. But I ain't his friend. You saved the life of his son, Lip. If anything ever happened to Lip, old J.T. would just naturally die. When Lip tells him how you acted, that old bow-legged son will sure be rearing to help you. Son, you don't belong here. You're going to quit it. You're going to quit that yellow-eyed kid that's gambling and drinking yonder. You're going to get a square chance. Rip sat there, his face grave, his eyes a little misty with a new hope. He was already sick of this outlaw game. He wanted to get away from Hank and all that Hank meant. But he was wondering why that big outlaw was going to all this trouble to help him. The answer to that came, as if the man had read Rip's thoughts. Your father, Rip, was one of the best friends I ever had. I reckon I can say he was the best. He helped me out once when not another human in Texas or north of Texas would lift a finger to help me. And if I can help Bill Hearn's boy, then I'll figure that I've done just a little something towards paying off that debt to him. So I'm sending you yonderly, Rip. How do you mean? There's a place in Arizona where you'll be plumb safe. Your name is Rip Hearn from now on. Where you're going, there will be real folks to look out for you. It's your chance to make a man out of yourself. I known, when you come into the hole, that you wasn't our kind. You're too much of a kid, and you're too much of a white man, Rip. So that's why I'm passing you along the line to where some real folks will take care of you and see that you make out all right. I can't quit Hank. No. Why can't you, Rip? Because we started out together. I know he ain't the kind of a partner to have, but we started out together, and it looks like I'll have to stick with him. Meaning, Rip, that you're scared of him? The big outlaw wondered, perhaps, just how the boy Rip would react to that. Would he get mad, or would he try to excuse the cowardice he was being told was in his makeup? Instead, Rip just grinned and shook his head. No, sir, I don't reckon I'm exactly scared of Hank. Someday, I figure that Hank will try to kill me. And when he does, it'll be me or him. No, I ain't scared of Hank. But we started out together, and it is kind of up to me to stick with him, that's all. We'll talk it over tomorrow, Rip. When you get sleepy, crawl into that end bunk yonder. We better be hitting the hay, I reckon. A growing boy needs his rest. The big man started to pull off his boots. He had told Rip to sleep in the bunk across the aisle of the long bunkhouse. Now came an interruption that was destined to change Rip's viewpoint. An abrupt interruption that was to start the boy on a trail he had never hoped to make tracks upon. The trail suggested by this big unknown outlaw who was now pulling off his second boot. For Rip's own particular code demanded that he stand by Hank. He had turned over to this big stranger every dollar he owned. His pockets were empty. But still, he felt that he could not quit Hank because Hank had got him out of the reformatory. He owed his freedom to the yellow-eyed youth yonder. Now Hank slid back his chair. His face was twisted into ugly lines, and his yellow eyes were bloodshot and a little insane. He spilled his tin cup of whiskey on the floor and threw the deck of cards across the bunkhouse. Rip saw that Hank was drunk. Drunk as a man can be, and still be able to walk and talk. I'll be back, said Hank, and he ripped at the collar of his heavy flannel shirt. Take your time going, said one of the card players, but hurry back. With more money, Button, put in another man. I'll be back, said Hank gruffly. That'll sure make the game more interesting. Hank glowered at the man who spoke, but he made no move to accept the slur. Instead, he lurched unsteadily across the bunkhouse floor toward where Rip sat pulling off his boots. Rip looked up at him without changing expression. He saw that Hank was drunk. Blind, crazy, stupid drunk. Come on to bed, Hank. Bed hell. Give me some money. Come on, Hank. Get to bed. You need a lot of shut-eye. Let me pull off them boots. Touch them boots, snarled Hank as he sat down on the edge of the next bunk, and I'll kill you. Give me some money. Give me that 500 I paid you on that bet. Ah, hell, Hank, forget it. You lost that money to me fair. Be a sport. Hank's yellow eyes hardened. Listen, kid. I ain't welching on that bet. I want $500 to set back in that game. I'll pay you back. I'll split with you, half and half, when I win. Come on, kid, give me some dough. Nothing doing, Hank, said Rip. Through the smoke-laden room, the older men watched this quarrel between the two young outlaws who had come into this haven for hunted men. There was the odor of tobacco and whiskey. The soft click of poker chips in the hand of a nervous gambler. The stud game had stopped, and every man there was waiting to see what would happen. Give me money, kid. I reckon not, Hank. Come on to bed. Scared I'll beat you out of a few lousy dollars, are you? Listen, kid. Get this all. I'm drunk, and I don't give a damn who knows it. I'm traveling the route and stopping nowhere. You and me started out together. Only for me, you'd be making horsehair bridles in the pen. I sprung you out of stir. Deny that. Nobody is denying that, Hank. Come on to bed. Shut up. Damn your hide, kid. I got a mind to gut shoot you right here. I get you out of that damned reform school. I put you onto the ropes. I get you in here when you hang back slobbering all over a lousy sheriff and his posse. Who shot them 5 bums? Not you, because it was too dark to see. Who bumped off that 6th gent? Me. I done the shooting, and you lollygag over them wounded cops like they was kinsfolks. A hell of a tough gent you are, ain't you? I spring you out of the stir. I frame the bank stick up and tell you how to work. I bring you here to the only place you're safe. And now, for a few lousy, dirty dollars, you turn me down like I was a white chip. We quit right here, savvy, you and me. That, said Rip, his lips tight and his eyes glittering, suits me. But before you go on, let me tell you this. What I owe you, I'll pay her back. Then give me some money. I ain't got $1, Hank. You what? I'm as broke as you are, that's all. It's a damned lie. Don't say that over, Hank, or I'll make you fight. Where's the money you had when you come here, then? I'm sending it back to the bank, Hank. Sending it where? Back where we got it. Back to the bank we stuck up. You gone loco? No. Listen, Button, don't try any fool game on me. I ain't in any condition to bat around fool jokes. Give me some money. Give me just about 500. I'll run her up into a bankroll, kid. Cut out this monkey work. Give me some money. Hank's tone was half wheedling, half belligerent. Rip watched his gun hand. I told you I was broke. That's the truth. I'm sending mine back to that bank. Just a dirty little stool pigeon, weak-livered coyote, are you? Just a little sneak, eh? Better not say much more, Hank, said Rip tensely. Why not, you coyote? Because you're talking fight talk. I'm talking it because you're drunk. Otherwise, I'd make you back your play. I'll back what I say, you punk. And when I'm done, I'll take that tight money out of your pockets. I don't think you. The door of the bunkhouse was suddenly kicked open. A man stood there, a tall, fur-coated man whose black Stetson was pulled across his eyes. He had a 6-shooter in his hand. His face was heavily bearded. A hush fell over the place. Hank, unsteady on his feet, leaned against the bunk opposite Rip, his yellow eyes fixing a bleary gaze on the newcomer. The men at the poker table quit looking at Hank and Rip. They eyed the fur-clad newcomer with eyes that were cold and menacing and suspicious. Every eye was on the stranger, who stepped inside and closed the door with his foot. Out of the hairy face glittered a pair of pale gray eyes. His gun was cocked. You there, Hank? His voice rasped. I want you. Hank recoiled, as if struck across the face with a rawhide quirt. His face went white. His yellow eyes stared at the man who stood there just inside the door. I was told you was here, Hank. So I come. I'm going to kill you. Fill your hand. Gosh, Pat, you wouldn't. Pull that gun, you sneaking rat. You double-crossing young skunk. I helped you out of that reform school. Then you turned me down cold. I'll kill you now. Fill your hand. Hank's drunken eyes were sobering. His face looked mottled under its spots of black frostbite and dirt. Rip, watching him with a swift, sidelong glance, thought Hank looked like one of these circus clowns whose pictures he had seen on the billboards. Rip smiled a little. Hank, with his face gone pale, his nose and cheekbones bitten black by the frost. Like a clown. Now he saw Hank's hand slide across the butt of his gun. Saw the hammer of that gun caught in a broken place in the gun scabbard. Hank froze, his yellow eyes darting to the big outlaw. His sneer faltered, and his hand hesitated on the trigger. The room remained tense, the only sound the faint crackle of the wood stove in the corner. Put it down, Hank, the big outlaw said again, his tone sharp but calm. You ain't got the sand to see this through, not with me watchin'. Hank's hand trembled. His gaze shifted back to Pat, who stood motionless, his left hand clutching his wounded wrist. Pat's gray eyes burned with a hatred that seemed to sear into Hank's soul. Slowly, reluctantly, Hank lowered the gun. He muttered under his breath, "This ain't over." "It's over," the big outlaw said firmly. Get out of here, Pat. And you, Hank, sit down before you do something even dumber. Pat hesitated, his pale eyes lingering on Rip for a moment, before he turned and walked out into the night, cradling his injured hand. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving a heavy silence in the bunkhouse. Hank slumped onto the edge of the bunk, glaring at the floor. Rip let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The big outlaw holstered his gun and resumed pulling on his boot, his expression unreadable. "Nobody dies in my house," he said simply. "Not tonight." Rip nodded, his jaw tight. He didn't trust himself to speak. Chapter 10. Hank shifted his yellow-eyed gaze toward the big outlaw. Rip was on his feet now, his gun in his hand. Half a dozen other guns were out, ready to spit fire. Rip broke the tense silence. He stepped toward Hank slowly, his gun in his hand. "Hank," he said bluntly, "right here and now is where you and I quit. We split the blankets right now. What I owed you, I paid off when I kept that Pat feller from killing you. We're quits." "That sure enough suits me," said Hank huskily. "Don't never try to hunt me when I leave here, Hank. Don't worry about that. You can go plumb to hell, so far as I'm concerned." Hank lurched out of the door into the night. Somebody was helping the man Pat with his smashed wrist. The big outlaw, who had called himself Townsend, spoke to Rip in a low tone. "Come morning, Rip, we'll pull out." "Yes, sir," replied Rip. "I'll be ready to go." "Sleep mighty close to your gun tonight, boy." "I will." Hank holds a grudge. Rip slept fitfully. The card game lasted until past midnight. Hank stumbled in an hour or so past midnight and made a bed of saddle blankets on the floor. He had gotten more whiskey and was bleary-eyed. Rip reckoned Hank would make trouble, but he was wrong. Hank slept like a log and was still asleep when Rip pulled on his overalls and boots and got into his chaps and overcoat at daylight. He and the big outlaw Townsend saddled up and rode swiftly out of the hole in the wall. Hank was left behind. Rip hated to think he was leaving Hank in a tight spot and said so to his older companion. "That young rascal will take care of himself, son. He'll find his own kind among them back there. Your trail leads in another direction." They rode all that day through the big drifts and pulled in at Lip Harding's line camp after dark the second day. Overhead, the stars shone like spots of silver lights. A wolf howled his song. Lip Harding opened the cabin door in answer to their summons. "Gosh, Townsend, you're a stranger. Who is with you?" "Rip Hearn, friend of mine, Lip. You met him before." Lip got a good look at Rip. He grinned and held out his hand. "I'll tell a man I met him. Come in. Got a posse behind you." Townsend chuckled softly and turned to Rip. "Lip is all wool and a yard wide, ain't he? Just cut out that wool stuff, Townsend. I'll help you put up your horses." That night, Townsend and Lip Harding talked until midnight. They wrote some letters and drew a map. Rip's stolen money was sealed in a big envelope. Rip dozed on Lip's bunk, half awake, half asleep, his brain utterly tired, his body relaxed. Finally, he slept. When he woke up, Lip was cooking breakfast. Townsend was gone. Rip felt guilty for having gone to sleep on Lip's bunk that way, but when he mentioned it, Lip threatened to throw him in a snowdrift. "Where's Townsend?" "He pulled out, Rip. Gone back to the hole in the wall country. He's safer there." Rip asked no further questions. Who or what the big Townsend was, he did not know. It was in accordance with his training under Deuce Campbell that he did not question further. He helped Lip with the breakfast, and they talked about a lot of things that had nothing to do with the Outlaw Trail. Finally, when they were washing the dishes, Lip voiced Townsend's plan. "Here's a map, Rip. It tells you where to stop and who to talk to. They'll stake you to grub, and a change of horses or whatever you need. Your destination is the K-Cross outfit in Arizona. That is where you'll start all over. I'm having Dad squash that bank robbery charge. The sheriff and Doc and every man who followed you will back my play to have that whitewashed. Later on, when the time comes right, we'll try and wipe out that Montana deal." Rip bit his lips to fight back an aching sob in his throat. He had known mighty little about kindness in his short but full life. "Gosh, Lip, Shut up, partner, or out you go with your head in the biggest snowbank I can find." "But how do you know I'll go straight, Lip?" "You are going to shake on it, Rip, and tell me that you'll play a straight game. That's all." Tears dimmed Rip's eyes. He held out his hand, and Lip gripped it hard. And so was made that pact that was to change the life of Rip Hearn. Outside, a low wind moaned. Both Rip and Lip started for the door. There was no mistaking that welcome moaning of the warm Chinook wind that would cut away the drifts and lay bare the ridges. That meant easy travel for Rip. A good omen, Rip. A lucky sign, all right, Lip. They stood outside the cabin, their heads uncovered. The warm wind caressed their faces. Already a drop or two of melting snow came down from the sod roof of the cabin. The drifts were softening when Rip shook hands with Lip Harding and stepped up on his horse. "You'll tell Townsend how I feel about it, Lip?" "You bet I will, Rip. Right when you get there. Ride your trail, Rip." "You bet I will. So long." And so Rip rode along his new trail and into a new life. Behind him lay the hole in the wall with its outlaws, its whiskey, its cards, its stolen money. Rip looked back. The snow was melting, and he crossed a bare spot on a ridge where the tracks of his horse showed plain. Tracks that might be picked up and followed. Followed, perhaps, by Hank, who wanted to kill him and who would always hunt him. Tracks in the snow and the mud under the slush of melting snow. Hank would follow that trail. Because Hank never forgot a grudge. Chapter 11. 8 years had passed since Rip left that line camp where Lip Harding had shaken hands with him. Now, Rip was top hand of the K-Cross, one of old JT's holdings. That old indictment against him, up there in Montana, had gathered the dust of 8 long years in its pigeonhole. Rip now was ramrodding a pack layout that was gathering wild cattle. He had fallen into that Southwest way of handling cattle. He could ride the worst horse that ever was roped out of the remuda on a frosty morning. Rip was a cowboy, and a good one. He had cattle savvy, and knew the knack of working a range clean in the rough country. And that is what puts the dollars in the bank for the owners. Every man in the outfit knew that when the present foreman of the K-Cross left to go back to Texas and his own outfit, which had begun to attract the notice of the oil folks, Rip was the cowboy who would step up into that job. And every cowboy on the K-Cross was waiting to see how Rip would come out. They liked him plenty. Rip, as wild a cowboy as ever pushed a pony down a slant, was due to ramrod the K-Cross. He was riding this pack layout now. Just a short roundup that old Tuck Murphy called a shindowie. But he was making a clean work of the canyons and the ridges. The traps were filled with wild cattle. There were 100 yearling and 2-year-old mavericks now wearing a fresh K-Cross on their left ribs. And even old Tuck Murphy, who rode the second best string of horses in the outfit, had to admit that Rip knew his job. They were coming down off the Mo Mountain with a small drive of wild stuff when one of the scary steers began to sniff the air. The others crowded up closer as the big spotted steer trotted on. Rip, riding on the point, sensed that something was wrong. He motioned to a cowboy to take his place and loped ahead down the wash. 200 yards from there, he pulled up his horse. In the middle of the wash was a freshly killed steer. The throat was cut. No bullet mark. And pinned to the brand with a horseshoe nail was a piece of paper. It was about 6 inches square. On it, a message was crudely printed. "They still want you in Montana, kid. Hank." Rip shoved the note in his pocket. His hands shook a little as he crumpled that bit of paper. His face had gone a shade pale under its tan. He thought for a moment about running. He had a war bag back at the food wagon, with a bedroll and the rest of his meager gear. He could ride back and grab it, and be on the trail in less than 15 minutes. A quick dig into the provisions would give him enough beans and biscuits for a few weeks. That would get him plenty far from the range, and a couple 100 miles toward Mexico. He would probably be safe across the border, find some Mexican outfit to cowpoke for, and keep his head down. He would stand out down there for sure, but there was a good chance he could hide out long enough to figure out what to do next. And he sighed. Start running now, and he might not stop. Spend every day for the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if a posse, or a bounty hunter, or some ambitious granger would connect him with a warrant out of Montana. Hunted. That was not the kind of man he wanted to be. He wished for a moment that his past had never happened, that it had been something different than what it was. A lot of men probably thought like that, he thought. But history is one of those things that men like him couldn't rewrite, no matter how much he wished it to be. The cattle were coming. Rip swung back in his saddle and rimmed the steers up the side of the wash and away from the freshly killed beef. But they had smelled the blood and acted crazy like cattle will when they smell fresh blood. "What's wrong?" called a cowboy. "Injuns been whittling on our herd. Dead steer down yonder. We must have surprised them, and they drug it. Shove them doggies around pronto, and keep them moving." Rip's brain whirled now. His eyes scanned the brushy-covered slopes. His hand was near his gun. In his eyes there were tiny lights. Lights that were like sparks of fire about to kindle into a sudden flame. Dangerous sparks. So Hank had followed the sign that he left that day, 8 years ago, up in Wyoming. Hank, who never forgot a grudge, had followed that sign from Wyoming to Arizona. Hank had come to kill him. But before Hank killed, he was warning like a rattlesnake. And that was not Hank's way. Hank, when he struck without warning. Rip reckoned now that he savvied something that had puzzled him a lot. Somebody had been stealing a lot of the K-Cross stuff. Mavericks, steers, even horses had been run into Mexico and sold there. And all they had ever been able to find was the tracks in the dirt. Rip grinned thinly. Hank is the huckleberry. He's the rustler. He couldn't keep from tipping his hand. He wants me to know he's stealing this stuff, and he figures I'll have to let him. So mused Rip Hearn, as he let his cattle and cowboys ride on down the wash. He pulled up and lit a cigarette. Then he rode slowly along the trail, back to the dead beef. "Long time no see you, kid." A lethal note in the sudden words. Rip's hand was on his gun. That voice had come from a dense manzanita thicket to the left. "Hold them hands high, kid." "I'll lift them, Hank," said Rip grimly, his arms going up. There was a thin smile on his face. "Keep them high, kid." "I will. Come on out of your hole, you snake. Let's see how tough you look by now." Rip knew that to shoot at that voice in the manzanita thicket would be folly. He wanted Hank out in the open. Then he'd take a chance on getting to his gun. Hank stepped slowly out of the thicket. He had a gun in his hand. 8 years had made their mark on Hank. His unshaven face was gaunt, deeply lined. A livid scar ran from one eye to the corner of his thin-lipped mouth. He looked twice his age. His overalls and jumper were shabby. His boots looked rusty and old. There was already a sprinkling of gray hair around his temples. His yellow eyes alone were unchanged. Hank had become a man. A hard-bitten, dangerous man. "What do you want, Hank?" asked Rip, his hands still in the air. "Money. I'm broke." "You come to a bad spot to find money, Hank." "I got no money." "You can get money. You're sitting on the world here. Got a job writing this K-Cross spread. You got friends. JT. Harding is worth millions. You can get me money." "Supposing," said Rip slowly, "that I tell you I can't get you money. What happens?" That sneering smile that Rip remembered crept across Hank's face. The yellow eyes were slits, ugly, half insane. His thumb moved across the hammer of his .45. "What happens?" "Kid, I kill you. There was a gent once, according to the fairy tales, that killed a goose that laid golden eggs. Figure that out." Hank frowned, momentarily puzzled. "Meaning what, kid?" "Meaning, Hank, that if I stay alive, I might be worth money to you. Dead, I ain't worth a plugged Mexican dime, and you know it. If you got brains, you'll look at it that way." "You mean, Rip, that you'll come across with the money that I need?" Rip grinned a little. He was thinking of that money he had saved here at the K-Cross. Money that he had put away for a nest egg. There was the girl Lois, who was running a little outfit for her crippled father, Lois Lane. Rip had never come right out and told Lois that he aimed to ask her to marry him, but he had hinted some. He had helped her brand her calves and gather her horses. He had rode out some broncos for her and made them into sure-enough cowponies. Rip had dropped in at the Lane place whenever he could steal a few hours away from his work. Christmas time and Thanksgiving, he always managed to stay there at the Lane Ranch. 4th of July, he always took Lois to the rodeo in town, and she would watch him rope and ride and bulldog steers. Rip had worked up into the first money at the rodeos, and was rated as one of the best ropers and riders in the country. Lois seemed to be almighty proud of him when he tied a calf in close to record time. She would walk down the street with him, hanging onto his arm, just like she thought he was as good a cowboy as ever forked a pony. Rip reckoned that he was in love with Lois. She was the first woman in his life, and he worshipped her as only a stargazing cowboy can love a woman. He had saved his money. When the other boys blew in their wages for booze and poker and the dance hall girls, Rip had saved his and kept it in the bank in town. He had thumbed catalogs that handled saddles and silver-mounted spurs and bits. He knew exactly the saddle he wanted. It was worth $100. There was a bit there that he had always wanted to buy, and a pair of spurs that he liked a lot. But he had salted away his money and done without. He had managed to get along with his old saddle. He told himself that he didn't need that fancy bit. And those shop-made boots that he had picked out of the catalog were still unpurchased. He ordered the cheapest boots they sold. So he had scraped and saved. He had gone without a lot of things that he wanted. When Lip Harding, who now was staying at the K-Cross Ranch, joshed Rip and tried to bully him into accepting money, Rip had told him that if he had to take charity money, he'd go back to the outlaw game. And Lip had the sense to know that Rip Hearn, above all things, was prideful and plumb independent and stood on his own feet. Rip looked into Hank's yellow eyes. Hank was as dangerous a man as you would want to meet. "You think I owe you something, Hank?" "To hell with that. I want money. You can get it. I want to pull out for South America, and you're grub-staking me. Charge the bill to the alkali dust and let the rain settle it. I want money, and I'll get it or kill you, one or the other. Hank, I ain't afraid of you. I never was afraid of you. I never expect to be afraid of you. If you need help, I'll help you. But I ain't standing for any man to throw down on me with a gun and make me come across with money. If you think that I'm putting out any of the Harding money, you're loco. You handle the checkbook for the K-Cross. Yeah. I have to pay off the boys and buy grub. But I ain't using $1 of JT's money to pay you. How about that golden egg proposition? Rip's grin thinned a little. His hazel eyes had that same light in them that had been there that hour when he had killed Deuce Campbell. He was ready to kill or be killed now. Hank, if you're up against it and need money, I'll help you out. It'll be my own money, though. You're a damn fool, kid. You always was. If you get money out of me, Hank, Rip went on, it will be money that I earned here working with this spread. It will be honest money. It will be wages that I made honest and square. You got no right to call on me for money. That night at the hole in the wall, we split the blankets. We're square. But if you need money, and you look like you do, I'll help you out of my own pocket. You talk like a damned preacher, kid. JT. Harding will never miss a few thousand. Come on, Rip. I don't want your lousy chicken feed. What I want is big cash. If you don't pay off, then there will be plenty more steers like that on there. It'll cost you some real money. You don't get $1 of JT's money, Hank. And if you think you can bluff me into any game like that, just start and try her on. You ain't paying, kid. Rip looked into Hank's yellow eyes. Not one damned penny of JT's money, Hank. Then ride along. I'll take this K-Cross layout to as pretty a trimming as ever a layout got. Ride along. Andale, vamoose. You'll have to hire a new crew to peel the hides off these dead K-Cross steers. Rip rolled up and lit a cigarette. He grinned down from his saddle at the gun in Hank's hand. Done any killing lately, Hank? That line rider at the circle was the last one. How many notches by now? 12, kid. You'll make 13. 13's an unlucky number, Hank. It'll never be notched on that smoke pole. Think not. I know it won't. Not unless you murder me here. I'd rather see you live and suffer, kid. I'm dealing you misery from now on. I'll whittle on this K-Cross herd till you won't have enough cattle left to bother an acre field. Then, when I get ready, I'll gut shoot you. Chapter 12. There was a movement in the brush. For a moment, Rip looked toward the sound. Hank's mouth twisted a little. Come on out, Pat, he said. From the brush came the man who had stepped into the bunkhouse at the hole in the wall that night 8 years ago. He leered at Rip. There was a look on his face that chilled Rip's blood. This man, Pat, was holding his gun in his left hand. His right hand had been amputated at the wrist. Rip's bullet had done that. To save Hank's life, he had crippled this man. The man who had ridden into the hole in the wall to kill Hank. Now Pat and Hank were working together, and they aimed to kill Rip when they got around to it. Well, said Rip, just where do you fit into this picture, anyhow? That button is just my own affair. Pat's voice was hard. I'll be making it a part of mine, said Rip. You and Hank think you can come down here and steal cattle from JT. Well, make another guess. I'm riding this layout for a spell. The only way you'll win now is to kill me. I kept you from killing Hank 8 years ago. I saved Hank's life. You lost a hand. I'm still alive and all in one piece. And I tell you here and now that it will take the two of you and a lot more such skunks to smash me and the K-Cross. That goes as she lays. If she don't lay right, commence. Pat crouched like some animal about to spring. His gun was ready in his hand. Rip watched the man with yellow eyes. He was outmatched 2-1. It was them or him. Yet he felt no fear of these two outlaws. For all the fact that Hank was a killer, Rip held him in contempt. He had seen the light of fear in Hank's yellow eyes. He knew that at heart, Hank was a coward. Of the man Pat, he knew this, that Pat had been afraid to call Hank that night at the hole in the wall until he had every advantage. His was a craven sort of courage given to trapped coyotes and hydrophobia skunks. "If she don't lay right, commence," he had called. Pat would have opened up on Rip. It was in his eyes, in the way he handled himself. "Cut it, Pat," gritted Hank suddenly. "I'm killing him," snarled Pat. "It was him that give me this stump of an arm instead of a hand. I'm killing him right now. He's my meat." "Before you go any further," rasped Hank, "listen to this. We ain't here to kill this gent. What we want is money. He's the goose that lays the golden eggs. Put up that cannon, Pat. I'm riding this. Rip is going to be a nice boy and put green money in our Levi's. Rip." "I got some money in the bank," said Rip. "Honest money. So far as the Pat gent is concerned, I could see him go hungry and get so gaunt that his backbone meets his ribs. But there was a time when you was my friend. If you need money, Hank, I'll stake you. But if you steal cattle from JT, it means war between me and you." Not far off came the sound of riders. Some of the K-Cross cowboys were coming. Hank and Pat heard the sound of horses kicking gravel and busting brush. A cunning glint came into the yellow eyes of Hank. His mouth grinned sideways. "Be at that cabin on Manzanita Creek tomorrow night with all the money you got, kid. I need it. There's a bullet hole in my lung that needs a doctor's care. I'm hungry and half naked. They been on my trail plumb down from Idaho. I helped you once, Rip. We started out like partners. Will you help a man? Tomorrow night at midnight at that cabin on Manzanita Creek," nodded Rip. "You said her, Hank." There was no moon. Just a cluster of stars up overhead. The smell of the pines. Death waiting. Death waited for Rip, who was fighting for the honesty that he had found, fighting against Hank, whose yellow eyes could see at night. Rip had left a letter for the girl Lois. It told her that he was going away on a long trip, and that she could somewhere find a better man. There was another letter to JT Hardin and a note for Lip. There was a $100 bill to pay for some flowers now and then, to place on the grave of the big outlaw Townsend, who had died last winter of pneumonia. Townsend, who had made possible Rip's chance for happiness, buried up yonder in Wyoming. So Rip had balanced his books that evening. He had shaved, and the cook had cut his hair. He had put on clean underwear, and new overalls and jumper, and a freshly washed flannel shirt. In his pocket was some money. His gun was tied to his thigh. He reckoned that tonight was the time for him to settle once and for all with Hank. He would give Hank a few $100s to get rid of him. If Hank got ugly, then they would scrap it out. And Pat would be somewhere near to take chips in the game. It was throwing the odds against Rip. But Rip didn't count the odds. He was thinking only of what he had to do, and what he was leaving behind if he died. He wondered how it felt to die. To lie there on the ground, a bullet in your belly, fighting for breath, fighting against that black inevitable. He wondered what death had to offer beyond this life here on earth. He wondered how he would stand the pain of those last moments of agony. To die game was part of a man's code. To give up head when a man was fighting against death, that was being a quitter. Hank would be waiting. Hank with the eyes that could see in the dark. Hank would have the advantage. Funny how a man remembered little things when he was riding to meet death. Rip was remembering Deuce, and how Deuce used to take off his boots and shake out the snakes that weren't there. He remembered Big Mo, and the water cure at the reform school. How he had met Hank, and how Hank had ripped open Big Mo's belly with that knife. Rip wondered if he'd be meeting Big Mo when he got killed. Rip pulled up. There was a man standing in the middle of the trail. The man was Lip Harding. "Lip," said Rip, "you gave me a start." "Did I, Rip? You like to scared me out of my boots." There was a long moment of silence. Rip was wondering why Lip Harding was there. Traveling, Rip, or just going somewhere? Traveling, Lip. Yonder? Lip eyed Rip closely. Most yonder, Lip. Figuring on just what? There was another silence. Rip reckoned that this was a one-man job. No use getting Lip Harding mixed up in it. Figuring on nothing, Lip. "That," said Lip Harding, "is the first lie I ever heard you tell, Rip." "Meaning how, Lip?" "Meaning, you bone-headed kid, that whenever a man does me the kind of a favor you did, he don't go out alone to fight. I'm with you, Rip, win, lose, or draw. You got money behind you, Lip. Your daddy is J.T. Harding. You got too much to lose. Where's Hank and this Pat gent waiting, Rip? What do you know about them?" "More than you'd expect. They've been in here for quite a while. I wasn't raised on a chicken farm, Rip. Let's go." Rip hesitated. Through his mind ran the threads of incidents. He and Lip had worked together. They had slept under the same rain-drenched tarp. They had pushed their ponies down the same slope after the same steer. They had watched the stars together and swapped the sort of talk that men swap when there is a moon, and that feeling of lonesomeness creeps into a cowboy's heart. "Better turn back, Lip." "Go to hell, bonehead." "It'll be a tough place, Lip." "Listen, do I look or act like a yellow-bellied quitter?" "Come on, Rip." They rode on together. Now and then their stirrups touched. "Lip. Spit her out, cowboy. J.T. is going to take it hard if anything happens to you. Better turn back." "J.T., said Lip, "told me that it was kind of all right, Rip. Fact is, when I told him where and why I was going, he said that if I didn't go, he'd think that he had a son that was as yellow as a coyote. Lead the way, bonehead." Beyond was the cabin on Manzanita Creek. Rip and Lip pulled up. The cabin was 100 yards beyond. As Rip and Lip stepped down from their horses, Lip spoke. "I saw Lois yesterday. I'm going to be the best man at your wedding if we come out of this, Rip." They gripped hands there in the darkness. Then, their guns ready, they moved cautiously toward the cabin that was hidden in the night. It was still half an hour until midnight. Rip and Lip crouched there in the darkness. Minutes seemed hours. That half hour seemed eternity. Then a man coughed in the darkness. Lip Harding's gun was spitting fire. Rip shot at the spewing flame out yonder. Now the bullets were snarling through the black night. But only one gun out yonder was barking. Rip, breathing hard, was jerking the lever of a carbine. Lip was lying prone, shooting, rolling to a fresh position, shooting again. Rip, bewildered by the blackness, was shooting blindly. The crack of guns. A man groaning as he died. The crimson and orange-colored flame of guns that spurted fire. Lip Harding's voice, over near Rip. Now a sudden burst of flame as something caught fire. Lip Harding laughed harshly. "Can of kerosene, Rip, old trooper. A dead center. Look at that blaze." How in hell did you hit it, Lip?" "Your old friend Hank," came the reply, "is not the only man who can see in the dark." "You mean that?" "Just as well as I see in daylight, bonehead. Yonder is your man. Get him." In the light of the burning kerosene and the wood it had ignited stood Hank. He stood there alone, his six-shooter in his hand. Rip walked toward him slowly. The fire showed them both in its reflection. "We finish her here, Hank. Just as well here as anywhere. Come and get it, kid." Rip crouched, half doubled up. He wanted Hank to shoot first. Hank had his gun cocked. His hat was off, and in the firelight his yellow eyes showed like the eyes of a cougar. "Come and get it, kid." "I'm coming, Hank." Odd how Rip thought of Deuce now. It was just like he had felt when Deuce had tried to kill him. It was kill or be killed now. It was him or Hank. But he wanted Hank to shoot first. Now Hank's gun ripped fire. Rip was thrown off balance by the heavy slug that tore through his thigh. It made him stagger. He was jerking the trigger of his gun, thumbing back the hammer of his .45. It all seemed like a red haze. He saw Hank fall. He heard the deafening echo of his own gun, Lip's voice. Now he weaved a crooked way toward Hank, who lay there in a weird position, sort of doubled up. Rip's thigh hurt like hell now. He fell, then got onto his legs, only to fall again. He could hear Hank's voice, calling through the smoky echoes of the guns that had belched out their message of death. Dimly, Rip heard Lip's voice. Lip was saying something. He got part of it. You got him, Rip. Nice work. I got the other, coyote. Hardly worth burying, Rip." Now Rip was there beside Hank. He was smeared with blood. There was the light of the fire. Hank's yellow eyes glazing. Hank's voice speaking in a rattling, husky whisper. "You win, kid. Pick up the marbles." Chapter 13. The smell of antiseptic and burning wood hung heavy in the air, a strange counterpoint to the usual aroma of horse sweat and leather that permeated the K-Cross bunkhouse. Lip, his face grim but his hands surprisingly gentle, dabbed at the blood-soaked bandage around Rip's thigh. "Hold still, you damn fool," Lip grumbled, his voice rougher than usual. "You're lucky that bullet didn't shatter the bone." Rip winced, but a stubborn grin touched his lips. "Wouldn't be the first time I've been lucky, Lip." Lip snorted. "Luck ain't got nothing to do with it. You just got damn good at dodging them leadin' kisses, that's all." He paused, his gaze hardening. "But you won't be so lucky next time, you hear me? You ain't invincible, you know." "Wouldn't want to be," Rip mumbled, his eyes drifting towards the flickering fire in the hearth. The cabin, usually a boisterous hub of activity, was eerily quiet. The laughter and the raucous card games were gone, replaced by a tense silence. The attack had shaken them all to their core. Lip sighed, the lines on his face deepening. "Those bastards, they almost got you. Almost got us all. They underestimated us. They thought we were just a bunch of cowhands, easy pickings. They didn't reckon on your sharpshooting or the way those boys fought." Lip shrugged, deflecting the praise. "Just doing what we had to do. But it ain't over yet. They'll be back." Rip nodded, his gaze fixed on the embers. "I know. They won't give up easy. They'll try to find another way in, another angle. That's why I'm staying here with you," Lip said, his voice firm. "Until you're back on your feet. And after that, we'll figure out how to deal with the rest of those coyotes. You don't have to stay, Lip. You got your own life to live. Don't you worry about me, Rip. I owe you one. Besides, I wouldn't feel right leaving you here with just these boys. You need someone you can trust." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Rip, despite the pain, felt a surge of gratitude. Lip, his friend, his brother in arms, had risked his own life to save him. He had faced down the fear and the danger all for him. "You know," Rip said slowly, "I never thought I'd see the day when you would be stuck in a cabin with nothing to do but nurse a wounded cowboy." Lip chuckled, a low rumbling sound. "Well, ain't life full of surprises?" I never thought I'd be spending my nights guarding a ranch house like some damn sentinel. You ain't bad at it, though. Rip grinned. You're a natural-born soldier, Lip. You should have been a ranger. Rangers? Nah, too much running around. Besides, I like this life. Ranching, family, it ain't so bad. He paused, his gaze softening. You gonna settle down? Get yourself a wife, raise a family. Rip's smile faded. Lois's face flashed before him, her eyes filled with concern. Maybe someday, Lip. Maybe someday. Lip nodded understandingly. You deserve it. You deserve some happiness after all you've been through. A long silence followed. Rip, lost in thought, stared into the dancing flames. He thought of Lois, of her gentle touch, her warm smile. He thought of the life they could build together, a life free from the shadows of the past. He thought of the K-Cross, his home, his responsibility. He had survived against all odds. Now, he had to find a way to protect it, to protect the men who had fought beside him, to protect the life he was finally beginning to build. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the walls of the cabin. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful reminder of the danger that still lurked in the darkness. But within the cabin, there was a sense of camaraderie, a feeling of shared purpose. They had faced death together, and in doing so, they had forged a bond that would last a lifetime. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He knew he had a long road to recovery, both physically and emotionally. But he also knew that he was not alone. He had Lip, he had the loyalty of his men, and he had the love of a good woman waiting for him. Do you like wild Western adventure? Can I send you a full-length novel free? Get your copy today. Rather, listen. I have over 30 wild Western audiobooks you can hear for free. Saddle up and click play today. The end.